1976, Mary Leakey's excavation team was working in the volcanic ash beds of Laetoli, Tanzania. Suddenly they uncovered footprints that defied every established principle of human evolution. Not just any footprints, but a trail that looked very familiar. These weren't the shuffling, ape-like tracks you'd expect from early hominids. They showed a pronounced heel strike, a strong arch, and a forward-facing big toe. The walking pattern was virtually indistinguishable from modern humans. The problem? These footprints were embedded in volcanic ash that dated to 3.6 million years ago. That's more than 3 times older than the earliest accepted evidence of modern humans. When the dating results were confirmed, there was a quiet panic spread through academic circles. These prints were too advanced, too modern, too problematic for the evolutionary timeline that had been carefully constructed over decades of research. In private correspondence that got surfaced online, one researcher admitted the footprints looked like someone had walked there yesterday. But changing the narrative wasn't an option. Instead of rewriting human history, the scientific community chose to reinterpret the evidence. The official explanation became that these must have been made by an early ape species that happened to walk with an unusually human-like gait. A theory built on hope rather than evidence. Over the following years, additional prints were discovered nearby, including what appeared to be kneeling impressions. Each new find only made the situation more uncomfortable. Behind closed doors, geologists and paleoanthropologists engaged in heated debates. Some insisted the evidence pointed to a form of early human far older than accepted, but funding for extended excavations was abruptly terminated. Access to certain sections of the site became restricted. Papers attempting to challenge the standard interpretation were rejected without proper review. What we're left with today is a sanitized story that avoids the deeper truth. The Laetoli footprints are anatomically modern, the dating methodology is sound, and no known species from that time period fits the evidence. If these walkers were human or human-like, then our entire timeline crumbles. Humanity becomes millions of years older than officially recognized, and entire chapters of our supposed evolutionary story vanish into the volcanic ash where they were found. But the suppression of inconvenient footprints was just the beginning. Our next discovery takes us even further back in time, to a remote location where researchers found something that technically shouldn't exist at all. In 2011, a GPS error led a research team off their intended route in the windswept plains west of Lake Turkana in Kenya. What they discovered in that untouched patch of land would challenge the very definition of what it means to be human. Half buried in ancient sediment lay stone tools of remarkable sophistication. These weren't crude rocks that might have been shaped by natural forces. They were intentionally crafted cores and flakes, showing clear evidence of intelligent design. The tools demonstrated controlled force, directional strikes, and repeated patterns of manufacturing. Someone had understood leverage, weight distribution, and the physics of stone fracturing. When radiometric dating placed these artifacts at 2.8 million years old, the implications became terrifying for mainstream archaeology. According to the official timeline, the genus Homo hadn't even evolved yet. Such advanced toolmaking shouldn't belong to any known species of that era. The discovery should have triggered a complete reassessment of human origins. Instead, it activated an immediate damage control response. Academic papers began using carefully neutral language like proto-toolmakers and transitional cognitive evolution. Anything to avoid the obvious conclusion that someone intelligent was creating sophisticated tools long before humans were supposed to exist. Within months of the initial publication, funding proposals for extended excavation at the site were mysteriously declined. Requests to examine nearby sediment layers were deemed not a priority by review boards. The research team found their follow-up investigations quietly redirected toward less controversial regions. Behind the scenes, Competing institutions argued over publication rights, not because they wanted to champion the discovery, but because they wanted to control how it was interpreted. A handful of researchers suggested the tools revealed evidence of an unknown lineage, a forgotten branch of early humans, or an advanced pre-human ancestor lost to time. These voices were systematically sidelined. Their conference presentations were delayed or cancelled. The message was subtle but unmistakable. This finding needed to be contained. The reason for such aggressive suppression becomes clear when you consider what the Lomekwi tools actually represent. They're proof that human intelligence didn't emerge gradually along predictable evolutionary lines. They suggest intelligence appeared, vanished, and reappeared in cycles we don't understand. They point toward the possibility of forgotten civilizations rising and falling long before the first officially recognized human took their first steps. By dismissing and burying this evidence, we've lost more than just ancient artifacts. We've lost the fingerprints of a vanished people whose story was erased before it could be told. And with their silence, we've also lost the possibility that our species is merely the latest chapter in a much older, deeper saga of human intelligence on Earth. These discoveries represent just the tip of an iceberg that extends far deeper into forbidden history than most people realize. The pattern is always the same. Groundbreaking evidence emerges. Initial excitement gives way to institutional pressure, funding disappears, and the discoveries fade into academic footnotes that few will ever read. But why would anyone want to suppress evidence of humanity's true age? The answer lies in understanding just how much depends on maintaining the current timeline. Entire academic careers are built on specific interpretations of human evolution. Billions in research funding flows toward projects that support established theories. Museums, universities, and textbook publishers have massive investments in the existing narrative. More importantly, these discoveries don't just challenge scientific timelines. They challenge fundamental assumptions about human progress, civilization, and our place in the natural world. If advanced human cultures existed hundreds of thousands of years ago, then our modern achievements become far less unique. We're forced to confront the possibility that we're not the first intelligent species to inhabit this planet, just the most recent survivors of a much longer story. What makes this pattern of suppression even more disturbing is how it extends to discoveries that should fundamentally reshape our understanding of ancient engineering capabilities. Hidden beneath the most famous monuments on Earth lies evidence of construction techniques that predate recorded history by tens of thousands of years. For over a century, whispers have circulated among explorers and military officials about vast tunnel networks beneath the Giza plateau. Most dismissed these stories as fantasy until 2008, when ground-penetrating radar scans near the Great Sphinx revealed something extraordinary. Massive underground voids appeared on the readings, descending corridors. What looked unmistakably like stacked chambers extending deep beneath the monument. The data showed geometric precision that could only be intentional. The scale was staggering, suggesting an underground complex far older than the pyramids themselves. But within weeks of these scans, every report vanished from public access. The discovery joined a long list of similar findings that had been systematically buried for over 2 centuries. Back in the 1800s, British diplomat Henry Salt documented his exploration of cavern systems beneath the plateau. He described long passageways and chambers that extended for miles underground. His detailed records mysteriously disappeared into private collections, never to be seen again. In the 1930s, Egyptian workers building homes near Giza accidentally broke through into another shaft system. They found carved walls and staircases descending into darkness before the opening was sealed within days. The most telling confirmation came in 1997, when the Egyptian government quietly declared the area beneath the Sphinx a military security zone. Official statements insisted there was nothing unusual underground, but leaked documents told a different story. The radar had identified chambers large enough to hold dozens of people, hallways carved with mathematical precision, and a central void directly beneath the Sphinx's chest that showed perfect symmetrical construction. Someone had built an advanced underground complex using engineering knowledge that predated dynastic Egypt by millennia. Someone whose identity doesn't fit any accepted historical timeline. The systematic concealment of this evidence reveals how much is at stake in maintaining Egypt's official chronology. Billions in tourism revenue depend on the current narrative. Global academic prestige rests on preserving a neat timeline that places Egyptian civilization at exactly 5,000 years old. If inscriptions or artifacts exist in those sealed chambers pointing to an earlier epoch of engineered structures, the world would be forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. Egypt may have inherited Giza, not built it. The implications ripple far beyond archaeology into questions about the cyclical nature of human civilization itself. But underground chambers beneath famous monuments pale in comparison to what satellite imagery has revealed across the Arabian Peninsula. Stretching across hundreds of kilometers of black lava fields in Saudi Arabia, are stone formations so vast they can only be properly understood from space. Perfect geometric shapes, long basalt walls, circular enclosures, and thousands of what researchers call desert kites that narrow into precise triangular funnels. From ground level, these structures appear random and meaningless. From above, they form unmistakable patterns of intentional engineering, like blueprints etched directly into the earth. When satellite imagery first revealed their true scale, archaeologists quietly panicked. These weren't supposed to exist. Certainly not at the ages suggested by the volcanic terrain they sit upon. Initial geological surveys placed many of these formations at over 300,000 years old, embedded between ancient lava flows that solidified long before our species is supposed to have emerged. Yet their design is unmistakably the product of human intelligence. The desert kites appear to have functioned as massive animal drive systems, requiring coordinated planning, long-term settlement, and a population capable of mobilizing large-scale labor projects. This wasn't the work of nomadic hunters gathering seasonally. This was evidence of organized civilization, and not a small one. Tens of thousands of stone structures built with engineering precision spanning regions the size of entire countries. When dating anomalies began circulating within academic circles, the response followed the familiar pattern: reinterpret everything rather than challenge established timelines. The official narrative shifted rapidly to describe these as Neolithic hunting traps, despite the obvious problems with that explanation. When researchers pointed out that many structures were trapped between lava layers hundreds of thousands of years old, funding for deeper geological sampling was withdrawn. Satellite data from key lava fields was suddenly reclassified as restricted. Field permits became nearly impossible to obtain for independent researchers. A European team attempting to publish evidence for extreme antiquity saw their paper rejected 5 times by different journals. Reviewers consistently claimed the conclusions were too disruptive to existing frameworks. The resistance wasn't based on flawed methodology or insufficient evidence. It was based on the catastrophic implications for accepted human history. A 300,000-year-old engineered landscape means our species was not the first to organize large-scale construction projects. It suggests another intelligence, older and more sophisticated than we've been taught to expect, once thrived in what is now the Arabian desert. It implies that civilization is not a recent human invention, but a recurring pattern that rises, flourishes, collapses, and leaves behind only stone monuments that survive the cycles of time. These Arabian structures sit in bureaucratic silence today, guarded more by institutional inertia than by physical barriers. What humanity lost by suppressing their real age is nothing less than the first chapter of our architectural story. A chapter written in stone across an entire landscape, erased by academic convenience, and sealed beneath layers of willful ignorance. The pattern becomes even more unsettling when we examine discoveries that push the boundaries of human settlement into time periods that challenge our most basic assumptions about species development. In 2019, researchers working near the thundering waters between Zambia and Tanzania uncovered something that defied every law of preservation and chronology. Wood normally disappears within decades, maybe centuries if conditions are perfect. It rots, collapses and returns to Earth long before stone begins to show wear. Yet preserved in the oxygen-poor, waterlogged sands near the falls lay two interlocked logs that had been shaped, carved, and joined together with unmistakable engineering skill. These weren't random pieces of driftwood or natural debris shaped by flowing water. The joints were cut at precise right angles. The notching showed deliberate planning and execution. Someone had created architecture, actual construction evidence of permanent settlement, in a place and time where such evidence shouldn't exist. When radiocarbon dating placed the wooden structure at nearly 200,000 years old, the results sent shockwaves through the archaeological community. Anatomically modern humans weren't supposed to build anything more sophisticated than temporary shelters until around 10,000 years ago. Yet here was evidence of someone 20 times older, demonstrating technical woodworking skills that required planning, measurement, and tool use, far beyond what the timeline allows. Microscopic analysis revealed something even more troubling. The cut marks on these ancient logs were too clean and too consistent for simple stone tools. Some grooves appeared to have been made with composite implements or early abrasives. Several edges showed evidence of polishing techniques that suggested technological capabilities well beyond what should have existed at that time. The implications were staggering, and the response was predictably swift. Academic journals hesitated to publish findings that contradicted established human development models. Critics demanded alternative interpretations before the evidence had been properly evaluated. Grants for long-term excavation were frozen pending administrative review that stretched on indefinitely. The research team expected scientific excitement and international recognition. Instead, they received warnings from senior colleagues urging them to reconsider their dating methodology because it would destabilize the entire field of human origins research. Even more concerning, satellite mapping of the area showing geometric soil disturbances along the river was quietly classified as environmentally sensitive, despite decades of safe archaeological work in the region. The sudden institutional pressure revealed just how threatening this discovery had become. If humans or human-like beings were building complex wooden structures 200,000 years ago, then everything about human emergence and development collapses. Agriculture stops being the birth of civilization. Stone architecture stops being humanity's first engineering achievement. The entire concept of primitive human ancestors dissolves into something far more sophisticated and far more ancient. Most threatening of all, it suggests something catastrophic about the nature of human history itself. That early intelligent cultures existed and vanished completely, leaving behind almost nothing except the rarest traces preserved by geological accident. The wooden structures at the falls should have triggered a complete rewriting of human origins. Instead, they were buried under academic caution, political pressure, and institutional fear of opening doors that no university wanted opened. Because if the world learns that people were building permanent settlements 200,000 years ago, then the most uncomfortable question becomes impossible to avoid. How many complete civilizations rose and fell before ours, leaving virtually no trace except for the accidents of preservation that occasionally surface to haunt our carefully constructed timelines? Elines, the evidence keeps mounting, and each discovery becomes more impossible to explain away than the last. Along the rugged coastline of South Africa, inside limestone chambers that have protected secrets for millennia, archaeologists uncovered something that should have revolutionized our understanding of human intelligence. But like so many other inconvenient truths, it was quietly reinterpreted and filed away where it couldn't cause trouble. When excavators sifted through ancient ash layers in the caves along Clayses River, they found organized fire hearths dating back 172,000 years. These weren't random campfires or accidental blazes. They were carefully structured fire pits that had been used repeatedly over thousands of years. Some were bordered with deliberately placed stones. Others contained layers of burned bone arranged in patterns that suggested intentional planning. Fire represents the first fingerprint of true intelligence, but this was something far more sophisticated than basic flame control. Chemical analysis revealed evidence of organized cooking, roasting marrow-rich bones, processing shellfish, and possibly even drying meat for long-term storage. The hearths showed repeated use of identical locations across vast spans of time, indicating stable settlement patterns that require planning, resource management, and cultural continuity. But the most controversial findings lay not in the hearths themselves, but in the bones scattered around them. Cut marks on fragments showed evidence of systematic butchering using tools more precise than expected for that time period. Some burnt bone shards appeared to be human, suggesting cultural practices that went far beyond simple survival. Whether ritual, ceremony, or something else entirely, these weren't the behaviors of primitive wanderers scraping by in the wilderness. Almost immediately after publication, institutional pressure mounted from multiple directions. Major journals downplayed the sophistication of the evidence. A comprehensive paper describing organized settlement behaviors was held for review for over 2 years, then published with most of its conclusions removed or heavily modified. Funding for deeper cave excavation was terminated. Requests for advanced dating methods that might have pushed the timeline even further back were denied without explanation. One researcher later revealed that department supervisors had explicitly warned against using phrases like early complex society in their reports, because such language would create unnecessary academic controversy. Yet the truth remained embedded in those cave walls, impossible to erase despite institutional efforts to minimize its significance. People living 172,000 years ago demonstrated cultural and technological complexity that shouldn't exist until 10 times later in human history. They managed controlled fire, developed stable dietary strategies, established long-term settlement patterns, and engaged in resource planning that forms the foundation of civilized behavior. If this evidence had been embraced rather than suppressed, humanity's story would have shifted overnight from a young species stumbling toward intelligence to descendants of an ancient, capable lineage whose knowledge survived catastrophes and forgotten ages. The pattern of suppression becomes even more disturbing when we examine discoveries that challenge not just human antiquity, but the entire narrative of how our species spread across the globe. In 2017, a research team in Southern California published findings that should have rewritten every textbook on human migration. Instead, it triggered one of the most vicious academic backlashes in recent archaeological history. The site contained mastodon bones that had been fractured with unmistakable signs of intelligent intervention. Spiral fractures, percussion marks, anvils, and hammerstones positioned exactly where trained butchers would need them for efficient marrow extraction. The bones were arranged in patterns consistent with sophisticated food processing techniques that require substantial knowledge and planning. But the behavior wasn't what sent shockwaves through the academic establishment. It was the dating. These weren't 15,000-year-old traces of the first Americans crossing the Bering Land Bridge. These were 130,000 years old, nearly 10 times older than any accepted evidence of human presence in the Americas. The implications were catastrophic for established migration theories. Land bridges, ice corridors, genetic bottlenecks, population dispersal models. All of it became irrelevant if humans had reached North America over 100 millennia earlier than allowed by official timelines. The possibility emerged that unknown populations had achieved transoceanic travel and settlement long before modern humans supposedly developed such capabilities. The academic response was swift and brutal. Critics didn't question the evidence itself, which was undeniable. Instead, they attacked the researchers personally. Accusations of incompetence flew through professional networks. Claims circulated that the bone fractures were caused by construction equipment, despite clear documentation that the site had been discovered in completely undisturbed geological layers. A senior archaeologist privately admitted the evidence was compelling but refused public endorsement, stating it would destroy too many careers if accepted. Another confessed that acknowledging the dates would require rewriting every textbook from the first page. The institutional investment in existing narratives had become too massive to allow fundamental changes. Requests for independent replication were systematically obstructed. A second excavation opened quietly by a separate institution was shut down within 2 months when it began producing similar anomalies. Leaked correspondence revealed heated internal debates within major universities about whether publishing follow-up studies would create more controversy than the field could handle. Funding agencies abruptly withdrew support for any projects exploring pre-Clovis populations in the Americas. The message was clear. Some questions were too dangerous to pursue, regardless of the evidence supporting them. What truly terrified the establishment wasn't the age of the discovery, but the sophistication it implied. Whoever occupied that California site understood advanced tool use, systematic resource processing, and long-distance travel planning. They weren't primitive wanderers who stumbled accidentally across continents. They were intelligent, deliberate, and technologically capable. Much too capable for comfort, and far too early for acceptance. If humanity or human-like species reached North America 130,000 years ago, then our modern global civilization isn't the first. It represents one iteration in a cycle of rise and fall that extends far deeper into the past than anyone wants to acknowledge. By dismissing and burying such evidence, we've lost more than archaeological data. We've lost doorways into chapters of human history that were deliberately erased from official memory. But perhaps the most unsettling discoveries are those that reveal just how sophisticated these forgotten peoples actually were. High on the frigid edges of the Tibetan plateau, where oxygen thins to levels that challenge even modern climbers, lies evidence of engineering capabilities that shouldn't exist anywhere on Earth, let alone at such extreme altitudes. At over 10,000 feet above sea level, researchers discovered cave systems containing cut bones, shaped tools, and polished fragments that represent impossible achievements. The altitude alone creates oxygen conditions that modern humans struggle to survive. Yet 75,000 years ago, long before our species ever reached the region, someone was not just surviving, but thriving there. Genetic analysis later revealed these weren't desperate refugees fleeing to harsh environments. They possessed specialized gene variants that boosted oxygen efficiency, suggesting they were specifically adapted for high-altitude living. This wasn't survival. This was mastery of one of Earth's most challenging environments by people who had evolved to dominate it. The artifacts they left behind were even more troubling for mainstream archaeology. Bone fragments bore parallel incisions so clean and deliberate they appeared almost machined. Stone tools showed precision angles that demonstrated advanced understanding of material properties and fracture mechanics. One piece, described by researchers off the record, displayed workmanship that was completely inconsistent with expected Paleolithic capabilities. In academic language, that description translates to something impossible, something too advanced, something that doesn't fit any accepted timeline or technological progression. Within months of initial genetic announcements, the cave site was placed under strict governmental oversight. Independent researchers found their permit renewals denied. Drone mapping was prohibited. Rumors circulated among graduate students that deeper chambers had been identified but quietly sealed for unspecified safety reasons. The lead researcher, who had initially spoken enthusiastically to journalists about the discoveries, suddenly stopped giving interviews entirely. The silence wasn't accidental. These findings threatened core assumptions about human technological development and environmental adaptation. If ancient peoples were engineering sophisticated tools at extreme altitudes tens of thousands of years before modern humans, then we weren't the first advanced civilization on Earth. We were simply the most recent survivors of a competition whose other participants had been erased by time, catastrophe, or deliberate concealment. What humanity lost through this suppression extends far beyond archaeological knowledge. We lost the opportunity to understand a forgotten civilization whose environmental mastery may have exceeded our own. The evidence suggests people who chose to live where others couldn't survive, who developed technologies we're only beginning to understand, and whose knowledge disappeared so completely that only traces remain in remote caves, guarded by bureaucratic silence. Some histories, it seems, were never meant to be rediscovered. Yet even these examples pale beside discoveries that challenge our most fundamental assumptions about the origins of monumental architecture and organized religion. In southeastern Turkey, on what appeared to be an unremarkable hilltop where shepherds grazed their flocks, excavators expected to find simple Neolithic village remains. Instead, they uncovered evidence of capabilities that shouldn't exist anywhere in the archaeological record. Massive T-shaped megaliths emerged from the earth, carved with intricate animal figures, celestial symbols, and abstract designs executed with precision that defied explanation. The stones weren't crude markers or simple monuments. They were sophisticated architectural elements weighing up to 20 tons each, arranged in complex geometric patterns that demonstrated advanced planning and engineering knowledge. When dating results confirmed the site was 12,000 years old, older than the pyramids, older than agriculture, older than any recognized civilization, the implications became impossible to ignore. This wasn't just ancient. This was impossibly ancient, predating every established marker of human technological development by thousands of years. But the deeper excavations continued, the more extraordinary the discoveries became. This wasn't a single monument built by ambitious hunter-gatherers. Multiple circular enclosures emerged, each demonstrating architectural sophistication that required permanent specialists, coordinated labor forces, and supporting infrastructure that could sustain massive construction projects over generations. The official explanation that nomadic tribes had somehow gathered seasonally to build the world's first temple collapsed under scrutiny. These structures required urban-level organization, advanced stoneworking techniques, and astronomical knowledge that indicated a fully developed civilization, not scattered bands of primitive peoples. Then came the most disturbing revelation of all. The entire complex had been intentionally buried. Layer after layer of carefully placed backfill, thousands of tons of soil packed deliberately by human hands to preserve and conceal the site. Someone 10,000 years ago had made the conscious decision to hide this place, not abandon it. They had sealed it as a message for future discovery. When the full implications became clear, the familiar pattern of institutional resistance emerged. The German archaeologist who championed the site found his grant renewals mysteriously delayed. Independent researchers requesting access were told the area was too archaeologically fragile for additional excavation. Proposed digs of deeper layers that might reveal even older construction phases were blocked by administrative review processes that stretched indefinitely. The oldest and potentially most revealing sections remain largely untouched, rumored to contain carvings and structures that would push human architectural achievement back even further into forbidden territory. The hesitation isn't based on preservation concerns. It's based on the revolutionary implications of what might be found. This discovery destroys the fundamental story of civilization's emergence. It proves that humans were organizing massive construction projects and creating monumental architecture thousands of years before agriculture supposedly made such achievements possible. It suggests that civilization didn't emerge after farming developed. Farming emerged after civilization had already been established by peoples whose capabilities we've systematically underestimated. If cultures capable of building such sophisticated complexes existed 12,000 years ago, then the question becomes unavoidable. How many complete civilizations rose, flourished, and vanished before ours, leaving behind only the stone monuments they couldn't entirely erase? What we're looking at isn't the beginning of human achievement. It's the remnant of achievements so ancient that their origins disappear into the mists of forgotten time. The mists of forgotten time. But if terrestrial discoveries weren't shocking enough, what lies beneath the ocean's surface reveals evidence that should fundamentally alter our perception of human civilization's true scope. Off the coast of Japan, where turquoise waters meet the East China Sea, divers have encountered structures so architecturally sophisticated they seem to belong in another world entirely. At depths ranging from 30 to 80 feet, massive stone formations rise from the seabed like monuments from a sunken city. Stepped terraces cascade downward in perfect geometric progression. Right-angled corridors stretch into underwater darkness. Towering monoliths stand sentinel over what appears to be ceremonial plazas and grand staircases that descend beyond the reach of conventional diving equipment. When these underwater structures were first documented in 1986, marine geologists immediately insisted they had to be natural formations. Erosion patterns, they claimed, tectonic fracturing, random geological processes that coincidentally resembled human architecture. But divers brought back evidence that resisted such simple explanations. Tool marks scarred vertical stone faces, where no natural process should leave such signatures. Channels had been carved with uniform depth across enormous distances. Megalithic blocks appeared to have been quarried from identical source materials and positioned with mathematical precision. Some sections revealed what looked unmistakably like roadways, connecting different levels of the complex. Most haunting of all was a colossal stone face, weathered by millennia of ocean currents but still retaining the unmistakable symmetry of intentional carving. The features were too regular, too purposeful to be accidents of erosion. Someone had shaped this monument with deliberate artistic intent, then watched as rising seas claimed their creation. When Japanese researchers published findings suggesting artificial construction, the academic backlash was immediate and devastating. University funding evaporated overnight. Administrative pressure mounted to retract conclusions that challenged established timelines. Several planned diving expeditions were mysteriously cancelled due to permit complications that hadn't existed for previous research in the same waters. Government agencies stepped in, declaring the site geologically interesting, but offering no explanation for the architectural precision that defined its most striking features. Meanwhile, independent divers reported discovering additional chambers and tunnel systems extending far beyond the officially recognized boundaries. Their claims were dismissed before the documentation could receive serious academic review. The stakes were simply too high for institutional comfort. If these underwater structures were intentionally constructed, then human civilization didn't begin 6,000 years ago in river valleys of Mesopotamia. It began millennia earlier, along coastlines that now lie beneath hundreds of feet of ocean water due to post-glacial sea level rise. Entire cultures, cities, and historical epochs would have been swallowed by rising waters, leaving only the most durable stone foundations as evidence of their existence. Such a revelation wouldn't resemble the orderly timeline presented in textbooks. It would suggest cycles of rise and collapse extending far deeper into the past than anyone wants to acknowledge. But the true threat wasn't archaeological, it was technological. The underwater site demonstrated engineering knowledge that officially didn't exist when it was supposedly constructed. Megalithic construction techniques, urban planning principles, and stone-shaping capabilities on a monumental scale. These were hallmarks of advanced civilization, not scattered tribal communities. If humanity was building cities before the last ice age ended, then everything we believe about technological development becomes suspect. Our modern achievements stop being unique evolutionary leaps and start looking like rediscoveries of capabilities that existed long before recorded history began. Today, these submerged monuments remain deliberately understudied, unprotected, and officially unrecognized. Each passing year sees more detail lost to ocean currents and natural erosion. While institutions maintain their silence, The evidence continues deteriorating beneath waters that guard secrets no university wants to confront. The pattern extends beyond individual sites to encompass entire landscapes of impossible antiquity. Across the Australian continent, Aboriginal oral traditions speak of engineering projects that dwarf anything in recorded history. Stories passed down through hundreds of generations describe the systematic modification of entire river systems, the construction of massive fish traps that required coordinated labour from thousands of people, and the creation of agricultural systems that sustained dense populations for tens of thousands of years. These 10 discoveries represent more than archaeological anomalies or statistical curiosities. They're fragments of a deliberately erased history, evidence of human capabilities that existed long before our textbooks claimed such abilities were possible. From footprints that predate our species by millions of years to underwater cities that challenge everything we know about civilization's origins, the pattern remains consistent. Revolutionary evidence emerges, institutional pressure mounts, funding disappears, and the truth gets buried beneath academic caution and bureaucratic silence. What we're witnessing isn't scientific skepticism. It's systematic suppression of discoveries that threaten the foundation of how we understand human development. Each suppressed finding represents a lost chapter in our species' story, a doorway into forgotten ages that were deliberately sealed to protect existing narratives worth billions in funding and academic prestige. The most unsettling realization isn't that these discoveries exist. It's that they represent only the accidents of preservation, the rare traces that survived whatever catastrophic cycles erased the rest. If civilizations capable of engineering feats were only beginning to understand rose and fell hundreds of thousands of years ago, then our modern world isn't humanity's first attempt at global civilization. We're simply the latest iteration in a pattern that extends far deeper into the past than anyone wants to admit. The evidence is there, waiting in restricted archives and sealed excavation sites. The question isn't whether humanity is older than we've been taught. The question is how much older, and what forces continue working to ensure that truth remains buried beneath the weight of institutional inertia and academic fear. Perhaps it's time we started asking why certain doors were never meant to be opened and what we might discover if we found the courage to open them anyway.